So this is actually a paper which I'm now revising. I'll be very happy to get any feedback. Also, since again, I'm not an Indologist, and I think there are so many scholars here who have also, scholars of Buddhism who will be able to maybe, shed more light on some of the things that I would like to right. So, as I said, this relation between Tibetan Buddhism and environmental protests began in 2011 and 12 in Arunachal Pradesh, in far eastern part of India. It's frequently coming into media limelight all the time. Even now, it is in limelight because of the conflict between India and China. And Arunachal Pradesh is a hot bone of contention. And even now, last night there was a news which was saying that China is building some villages on certain parts that fall in Indian territory. But anyway, that's all geopolitical things. But what I want to, highlight by referring to that new news item is that, Arunachal Pradesh as a whole, the whole state of Arunachal Pradesh is the subject of a big border conflict. And the areas that I did my ethnographic work in, which is the western part of Arunachal Pradesh, which is the Tibetan Buddhist part. Mostly, there are Christians in Arunachal Pradesh. There are also people who have migrated from other parts of India. And these two districts, Tawang and West Kameng, which is in the western part, which borders Bhutan, Tibet. So that is the part where I did my field work, and that is the part on which I'll be focusing in today's presentation. So I have also, worked on this movement against the construction of dams in 2011 and 12. There were these, monks who were out on the streets. They were going from house to house, knocking on door to door. It was a campaign to mobilize people against the construction of dams. And most of these, the leaders of this, an environmental movement or environmental protest were monks either who lived in Tawang, who were from Tawang and West Kameng districts, or they were monks who had gone to study in, Karnataka, in the Tibetan monastic universities outside of Arunachal Pradesh, and then come back. And there were also many of these, connections between the monks in Tawang and West Kameng and their counterparts in Dharamshala, where the Tibetan government in exile is, and in Karnataka, where a lot of students of Buddhism congregate from the Himalayan areas. And so there were these connections as well. So there were all these, dialogues already there. So environmental protests in which were some kind of an environmentalism, which was very, prevalent in South India, in Dharamshala, were also traveling to Arunachal Pradesh. So the environmental movement in Arunachal Pradesh was also a reflection of these kind of dialogues between the monks, the Tibetan Buddhist monks in Arunachal Pradesh, and Tibetan Buddhists outside of Arunachal Pradesh. So there was a big resistance against certain state schemes to start damming parts of Tawang Chu, or the river which flows to Tawang, and also other parts of, Arunachal Pradesh. And then the conflict eventually led to an encounter between the police and the monks and the civil society, leaders and participants. And eventually a couple of monks were killed, a couple were injured. And so this also became later an agenda for certain monks to contest the 2019 elections. So they said that, environmentalism was part of their agenda. Said that one of the main, agendas of their for them to contest the elections. And they did not win, but still, that did again bring the monks into highlight, into the limelight as these environmental actors. So I'm giving this backdrop to trace this kind of connection that was there in Arunachal Pradesh between Tibetan Buddhist monks and the environment, and the whole idea that Tibetan Buddhism is environmentalist in its approach. And this is not unique, of course, to only the Himalayan areas. There are similar kind of movements in Sikkim. There are in Ladakh, and where protests against any kind of environmental degradation is framed in the idiom of Buddhism. And it is something that's common to other parts of the of Southeast Asia, of South Asia. In Thailand, there were these Thai monks who were called Thai ecology monks, who became very famous because they championed the cause of environmental preservation. They conducted, tree ordination. So normally, ordination, long life ceremonies, these are rituals which are conducted for persons, but they conducted these for forests, for rivers, and they were trying to show that they are also beings that had to be preserved and protected. And this is also something that in Vietnam and in Sri Lanka, there were monks who practiced or preached engaged Buddhism. So more of a Buddhist approach, which advocated engagement with community life, with social life. And so they were all connected, because Sri Lankan monks influenced Vietnamese monks influenced the Thai monks, and in India, in Tibet, there were also all these connections which were which were also elaborated by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who has always taken a very pro-environment stance. In fact, since the 1980s, he has he has written a number of books and articles. He has given many speeches where he's talking about how the environment is so important for us. And even after the COVID pandemic started in April 22 in 2020, on the anniversary of the Earth Day, he had given this kind of an environmental message that it is actually our Mother Earth which is teaching us. So COVID is teaching us a lesson. It is teaching us how to become more responsible, because we are, as human beings, we have not been kind enough to our planet. So we have to actually, regain this sense of responsibility. So this kind of a message he had given in April 2020. So this is a stance which many Tibetan Buddhists in India also follow. So it has also become part of, in fact, the Tibetan identity. So being environmental has become part of the Tibetan identity, and it has become interlinked also with the religion, so Tibetan Buddhism. So there is some kind of a now equivalence between Tibetan Buddhism and being environmental conscious, and this has been, of course, dealt with by some scholars. The relation between Buddhism and modern environmentalism is not something that the Dalai Lama started, or Buddhist monks in other places started. It was a connection that was started by some Western scholars. In fact, many scholars who in the 1970s were starting to talk about more, anthropocentric, a more ecocentric approach to save the environment rather than an anthropocentric environment. They were trying to show how there were all these Asian religions which were actually more pro-earth or pro thinking of this, preservation of earth, rather than some of these, Western Christianity. So Arne Nice, who in 1973, he gave this approach called deep ecology, which means that one has to have an ecological consciousness which goes deep. One does not have to, one cannot be ecological just by focusing on superficial things. Like, nowadays we focus on superficial things like, certain things like, not superficial, but things that do have an impact, but it's so those acts themselves cannot help unless we fundamentally change certain values within us. So for example, segregating, let us say, for example, just to give an example, segregating biodegradable, non-biodegradable is definitely something that is important. But just by doing that, if we think that we have done our bit to save the environment or save the earth, is not enough. Because if we continue with our consumerist tendencies, if we continue to be very individualist and very selfish in our attitudes, if we can, that will lead to exploitation of the earth, and it's not going to really help. And so we have to fundamentally change our value system. And so basically, how can we become more ecocentric, think of the earth as a whole and not anthropocentric, not think of environmentalism as something that needs to be undertaken so that it can serve mankind, not just keeping human beings at the center, but making the earth, keeping earth in the center. So not how what can be done, why should we not about saving, reducing maybe the forward march of all this climate change, because we have to do something to avert climate change, because we need to save human race. So no, that's not how it should be. Climate change or reversing climate change is not about saving the human race. It's about doing something so that earth can be preserved, not so that or thinking about a new maybe planet where we can go and inhabit again, because that just means that the earth will be left behind. So it's not about that kind of approach. Is very anthropocentric. So how can we be more ecocentric in our approach? So that also then means if we are changing our value system, it also means that we have to be against materialism, and we also have to think about this interconnectedness of Earth's beings, of the human and non-human world. So all these things that modern environmentalism, which is of course many schools, but it includes some of these features. So these environmentalists also used or adopted Buddhism as something that is favorable to such kind of environmental perceptions or such kind of environmental views. And they found the connections between their stance against materialism and the Buddhist stance of being not attached, of non-attachment. Their stance of interconnectedness with the Buddhist stance of philosophy of dependent origination. So all these things, they tried to bring about a relation between Buddhism and modern environmentalism. And so they were, of course, very responsible for this representation, for this image of Buddhism being as Buddhism being an ecologically friendly or an environmentalist kind of a religion. And this is, of course, a representation that was very much taken up by Buddhists, by many Buddhist leaders, and including the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama, when he came as an exile to India when he came as an exile leader to India in 1959, and after that he also started interacting with many Western leaders. He went to many global forum, and after that also became aware about the problems that the environment is facing, and also inculcated these representations of Buddhism and championed this in his own speeches, in his own writings. And this representation of Buddhism as modern environment is such, there's therefore continued to travel, continued to expand, and also it continued to expand to other parts of the Himalayas as well, where there were Tibetan Buddhists and who were trying to also become part of this Buddhist world. So Buddhism then became represented as ecological. So we had all these words like eco-Buddhism, ecological monks. In fact, Jataka tales also, which as children we used to read in comic books, and they were stories about animals, and that's all that we thought they were. But they were also represented as ecological fables, as something that contained a message about saving the environment. So, for example, there's this fable about Monkey King, and there were these hordes of monkeys who were living in a tree, and that was a mango tree, and they used to feed on the mangoes, and the mango was very delicious, and they tried to keep it a secret, and they did not want human beings to come and find that mango tree. But once one of the mangoes fell into the river, and it floated downstream, and then it was discovered by somebody who then gifted it to the king, and the king was so, enamored of the flavor that he took a search party and went in search of it, and then he traced it back to that tree, and he saw that there were monkeys, and he had to evict them. And in trying to evict them, when he was trying to evict them, and he was trying to destroy the monkeys, he was trying to kill the monkeys, his forces were trying to kill the monkeys. And then the monkey king, in order to save his own people, his own his friends, his subjects, he stretched from one tree to the other and created a bridge of his to his body, so that which enabled his other monkeys to cross him. And by the time the last one crossed over safely, he had almost collapsed. And the king was the human king, of course, was very surprised, and he was very surprised at this kind of compassion. So basically, these were also moral tales about different incarnations of Buddha before his bodhisattva became a bodhisattva. But he was the monkey. This fable was also taken as an ecological fable, as something that also spoke about compassion towards nature and human beings' destruction of nature. And so that's how they have been represented. And this is a very popular theme, to think of the Jataka tales as also being an ecological, in line with this representation of Buddhism as also being ecological. But then how true are these representations? So that was a question that I started to think about when I was reading about these representations. So what do canonical texts say about how an individual Buddhist should respond to animals? So first of all, we have these scholars of Buddhism, philosophers of Buddhism, who have written about this, and I've used their writings to understand more about what the classical texts say about how the Buddhist should respond to animals. There are, of course, different degrees, different categories. So monks have more responsibility. So monks, more than the lay person, is told not to hurt animals, to release animals who are caught in traps, and so on. And however, there is a difference in which the killing of animals is ranked in relation to other offenses, like killing human beings, or stealing, or lying, or sexual offense. So all that kind of offenses actually can lead to disrobing, to your expulsion from the monkhood. But killing of animals does not really lead to an expulsion from monkhood. And Ian Harris also talks about how the practice of non-injury to animals, that means you cannot harm animals, but it is valued for its instrumentality. That means if you are good to animals, if you're kind to animals, if you release animals caught in traps, then you are basically incurring good karma. So you are ensured of a better rebirth, kindness and compassion. So basically, it is your kindness to animals is valued because of what it can serve you. So it's an instrumental approach. That is what Ian Harris says, and it is not reflective of how you value or the kind of value you place on the animals themselves. So rather than being about the animals, it is more about what being kind can do for you. So there is an instrumental gaze involved here. How is the plant world treated in Buddhist texts? So the plant world, in fact, is missing from this whole world of being. If you look at the whole, the wheel of life depictions, you find that animal world is still there, but the plant world is absent. In fact, forests are not even seen; they're seen as transient, and they're also seen as something unknown and wild. And this is also keeping in mind that Buddhism was actually an urban civilization, which arose, urban civilization. Cities, of course, come into being through deforestation, through destruction of the wilderness. So the plant world is actually not there; it's missing from Buddhist texts. Now, if you look at the writings, if you look at ethnographic work of scholars of anthropologists of Buddhism, we find that Tibetans or Tibetan Buddhists, they traditionally hunted and they killed animals. In fact, there is a lot of debate about whether Buddha himself was a vegetarian, and many scholars say that, well, Buddha himself was a meat eater. In fact, he did say that one has to practice compassion, one has to be kind, and it is okay to that's how some debates are said, that Buddha said that it's okay to eat as long as you're not yourself killing the animal. And this is something that the Dalai Lama also has preached, and this is also something that I have encountered in my field work, where people say that, well, it's okay. So people say that as long as you have not killed the animal yourself, but you have just consumed it, it's okay. So it's not a problem. In fact, yak meat, yak is actually a pretty common animal in many of these Himalayan highland areas, and it was consumed pretty regularly among many Himalayan Buddhists in Tibet, in Arunachal Pradesh, in many parts in Mongolia, in Bhutan. There were all these, you can trace that Buddhist belt across the Himalayas, where yak meat was consumed as part of their cultural practice. However, what happened, according to Tony Huber, who is a scholar of Buddhism, that there was a greening of Tibetans, as in Tibetans were constructed as green or environmentally friendly by political religious leaders in the 1980s post exile, and also after their encounter, their dialogues with Western environmentalists, and it became linked to both Tibetan nationalism and to identity politics. So the green Tibetans were contrasted with the Chinese. So if the Tibetans were environmentally friendly, then the Chinese were ecologically destructive. So that kind of a dichotomy was constructed. And this kind of image or representation of Tibetan Buddhists as environmentalists also traveled to the borderlands of the Indo-Tibetan borderlands, to the Himalayan borderlands in India, because many of these communities were they were on the peripheries of Tibet, but later they once the Indian nation and the Chinese state were formed, they became borderland Buddhists, and the Indian state also tried to cultivate them. They were also trying to bring them into the national cultural framework. So they were also recognized as being being Tibetan Buddhists. In fact, they also became more conscious about their Tibetan Buddhist religious identity post independence, as more and more cultural practices they were included in more and more cultural practices of Tibetan Buddhism. So by default, they also took on this identity of being, Tibetan Buddhists, and also as relatedly as being environmentalist. However, as Ian Harris asks, are we really describing a phenomenon which naturally arises from the heart of the Buddhist tradition, or simply a series of compatible secular concerns which can be happily assented to by contemporary Buddhists? So basically what he's saying is that, is this environmentalism, this idea or image of Buddhism as being ecological, are they really something that is traditionally or present, or are they something that's part of modernity, which Tibetan, not just Tibetan Buddhists, but Buddhists across the world have adopted? And Damien Kyon, another philosopher of Buddhism, has also said that these concerns that we call modern environmental concerns, such as greenhouse gases, global warming, these were definitely not present in 6th century BC. They were not present Um, uh, in fact, some people say that it is only, the Anthropocene, post 17th century, that this kind of global warming, this kind of environmental crisis has actually sped up. But what he's trying to say is that these are questions that did not really occur at that time. So these are not questions that Buddhism had to deal with. So how can we retroactively assign ecological concern to Buddhism when these problems, environmentalism itself is pretty recent, in 1970s. 60s, 70s onwards, it became very, prominent worldwide. So how can we retroactively assign that concern or that environmental ideology to Buddhism? So in fact, he goes further to say that, in fact, Buddhism has to modernize, has to become more, adapt itself more, and only then it will be able to take part properly in modern environmentalism. However, he also has a more nuanced kind of conclusion. He says that one can draw certain lessons from Buddhist teachings as a whole, because there is an emphasis on compassion, on self-restraint, on non-violence, on non-greed, and so they do provide the basis for an environmental virtue ethic. So kind of an ethic which can be which can lend itself to environmentalism, or to the objective of environmental conservation. Susan Darlington is also an anthropologist who I'm quoted here, who's worked on Thailand. And similarly, she says that there is a focus on these Buddhist teachings by monks who are engaged in environmental preservation. And so if they have been successful in mobilizing people and making people become more environmentally conscious, then what's the harm? So basically, if it is serving a purpose of making people environmentally conscious, of reducing certain behaviors that can harm the environment, if associating Buddhism with good environmental practices has some practical effect, then what's the problem? So basically, that's what Darlington also says. Now, I'm coming to my research area, which is this is a map that I've borrowed from the internet because it's a good one, and it shows the area where I've done work. Tawang and West Kameng, these are the two districts where I did my field work. As you can see, it's bordering Bhutan and Tibet, and towards the south we have Assam, where I'm from. So Buddhist environmentalism has now actually become more tied up with the politics of identity, with the politics of Tibetan nationalism, and also in the case of the Indian, Himalayan Buddhists, Buddhist environmentalism has also become tied up with the nationalism, with an Indian nationalism, not just Tibetan nationalism in exile. Because as I said, yes, it is true that Tibetan nationalism in exile rests on this construction of a green Tibetan, that is an ecologically conscious Tibetan Buddhist identity. But in the case of the Himalayan Buddhists of India, it has also become tied up with Indian nationalist politics. And this is where I think I have tried to make some comments that when we look at, as an anthropologist, so when we look at ecology, when we look at environmental, when we look at the everyday practices of the Himalayan communities, and we try to understand them, or try to limit them, or maybe frame them within one religion, then that religion, or that religion becomes the main anchor of a kind of an environmental identity. So it becomes like a Buddhist environmentalism, or it becomes like Hindu environmentalism. And the same thing can happen with indigenous discourses as well. So when we talk about indigeneity, when we talk about indigenous people, there is also a chance of some romanticizing native people. So again, there have been criticisms of this approach, that native people as being one with nature, as being, somehow inherently ecological. As so traditional knowledges, I mean, there is the gain, of course, of looking at this, but trying to romanticize or essentialize any practice as within some kind of a tight pigeonhole becomes a little difficult, because when we look at the everyday practices, it's not that these everyday practices of people in the Himalayas, and I'm looking at only them, or I'm talking only about the Himalayan communities because that is where my research is. So here we see that it's not really it's not really some kind of a imagined cultural universe of Tibetan Buddhism, some kind of a cosmology which guides people's behaviors, but it's also these routine kind of interactions, these associations with the natural world that tie people, nature, and I should not have put religion there, but it's tying people and nature into a kind of a complex. And when there are certain practices which clash with that imagined environmental identity anchored in a religion, then they are given a negative light, and they are sought to be removed, they're sought to be excised. So that's the problem, that whenever there is some kind of essentialist framing of practices, and it becomes either as indigenous people or through the lens of a religion, then it circumscribes certain behavior, certain practices, and says it constructs some kind of a moral universe, what is good, what is bad, and if there are certain features which do not fit into that environment identity, then they are sought to be removed. So my fieldwork involved mainly the Monpa communities, and though Monpas are predominantly Tibetan Buddhists, there are many who are not Buddhists. Some of them, very few have converted to Christianity, but some have. Then there are some who are on the fringes, so they are not even considered proper Buddhists by others in the Monpa community. So there are, of course, different degrees in which Tibetan Buddhism has percolated Monpa society. However, now this is what my previous work has tried to do, that now people are very self-consciously trying to assert a Tibetan Buddhist identity. There is a politics of identity in place, but I'll come to that later. And when we look at the relation between Yaks and Monpas, there are, of course, groups of Monpa communities called the Brokpas, who have traditionally been yak herders. They tend to yaks, they store yak products, milk products, yak cheese, yak butter. There is to be trade of yak cheese and yak butter. Those products is to be part of a trans-Himalayan trade network. Yak meat was also stored because of for winter consumption in various ways. And this is not just in Arunachal Pradesh, but in the Himalayan areas, all the communities where we find yaks, we find similar kind of food practices. And yaks were not just part of the material culture, not just part of the food practice, but they were also ritually very important. So if you look at Monpa oral narratives or folklore, you see yak in many folk narratives. You find yak dance. Yak dance is very part of Monpa cultural performances. When I went to the field and spoke to people, yaks were there in many of these folk tales. There was one yak where there was one story where it's a story about a group of people. They're looking for a ruler, and they're searching. They have these search parties. They're going here and they are looking for a ruler, and then they find a group of children playing, and so they show the children an array of meats. There is sheep meat, there is yak meat, there is fowl and chicken meat, and then the child who chooses the yak meat, he is immediately identified as a ruler, because yak is also associated with the ruling clan. Yak meat is supposed to have a higher ritual rank in the food hierarchy. And there are all kinds of, other kinds of myths and other kinds of oral narratives where yak plays a very prominent role. And yak was also very much part of the diet because of the high altitude. In fact, yak husbandry, yak pastoralism, transhumans, that is part of Manpa livelihood also. Some groups of Manpa livelihoods. Chicken was not available. So, in fact, bovine diet, bovine-centric diet, yak, various crossings of yak and cattle or cattle, all these bovine-centric diet, these were the main sources of protein. Of course, now with more networks, with plains areas, other supplies of other kinds of meat, there are now, you can find fish, and you can find chicken also in the markets. But earlier it was not possible. So both culturally, in terms of economically, the bovine-centric diet was very much a feature. But since 2017, there is an official ban on yak meat and all kinds of bovine meat in Tawang and Yaska West coming. This is also now still continuing. And it's really, it doesn't mean that people have stopped consuming, and there are still underground channels, and it isn't so visible in the markets as it is earlier. Earlier in 2008, 2009, when I used to visit, it was possible to see it being sold. So if there is some trader coming, or if it's a big animal, so it's also possible that a lot of people are fed with one, a single animal. So it was really also in that sense more economical, as some scholars have also said. But now you don't find that in markets openly, but it's there still. So these are just some pictures, and this is that was a woman yak herder, and this is actually a yak in a yak farm. Actually, there are also government initiatives to try and protect the yaks, and there is a center called the Center for Yak Research. And the yaks are very special in the sense that they cannot climb to lower altitudes. They cannot survive below lower altitudes. And that has now become more difficult with climate change, warming of altitudes. Also settlement. A lot of people, especially also military settlements. There are lots of military camps which have taken over yak pasture land or yak grazing lands. So all those associated phenomenon of state formation, of deforestation, of global warming, and also yak herding itself becoming less lucrative. So all these things have definitely made yak herding a little difficult as a livelihood for people earlier. So the traditional livelihood has become threatened. So there is this center for yak, which was started, I can't remember, I think it was very, very old, a very old center for yak research that was started. So some people now say that although there is this underground, network of channels through which one can acquire and procure yak meat, but still people, when you talk to people, unless you become very familiar, unless you earn their trust, people will generally say that we don't eat yak meat. We are vegetarians. We are Buddhists. We do not believe in killing. And so they also give the reasons of environmentalism. And they also say that, yes, it's okay that there is this ban because there is, it serves the purpose of environment. And they also cite the Dalai Lama. And it is also related to this, national politics of food, where there is a stress on protecting, the cows, but any form of bovine species. So I think this whole discourse of yak ban, of environmentalism, of Buddhism, it also, stems from a politics of cultural identity. And I've actually tried to look at this politics of cultural identity, not looking at the yak ban, but looking at how people are increasingly asserting a Tibetan Buddhist identity, a uniform Tibetan Buddhist identity. Earlier, some of these communities were marginal, they were peripheral Buddhists, even in relation to Tibet, they were peripheral Buddhists. And even now, geographically and culturally, they still feel that they're marginal in relation to a mainstream, Indian nationalism. And so they are asserting a Buddhist identity to counter that form of marginalization. And since Buddhism is now entangled, especially in the discourse of Tibetan Buddhist communities in India, it has become entangled with environmentalism. So that there is this connection, there is this entanglement between what people say when they ostensibly they say that, well, if we are supporting, we don't eat yak meat because we are Buddhist. So there is all this entanglement in these different positions of being a Buddhist and of not eating yak meat, and all this politics of identity. And it is also related to the national politics, because being Buddhist and also being Indian, how they are brought together in the politics of the Himalayan communities, that we are Buddhists and Buddhism is part of Hinduism. I mean, it is a section. That's how it is, represented, that we are also Jains, Buddhists, we are all kind of, actually Hindus. So that's a one narrative that some of these community, some sections of these communities are asserting. And it is related to other
the post 1980s commercial developments, including
okay, I don't know what happened. So anyway, so I think it's also related to the kind of cultural developments that have happened, where these places are increasingly framed as Tibetan Buddhist, as Buddhist spaces, through tourism, through cultural performances. And so there is a image kind of makeover that we are Tibetan Buddhist places. So, and Tibetan Buddhists, we are Buddhist communities. So that's happening both through construction of monasteries, construction of or renovation of Buddhist sacred sites, and all that. So what I'm actually interested in bringing all these things in this paper is to actually say that, as anthropologists, we study the everyday, we study daily practices. I think it's very problematic if we focus on this kind of decontextualized religion, which is devoid of its practical context, as coming to the rescue of environment. And it's actually this local everyday practices which actually should be given more importance. So when, in fact, there are other scholars also who have written about other parts of Himalaya, not just the Buddhist Himalaya, but also Hindu Himalayas. For example, Georgina Drew is a scholar who's written about the Ganga. People in Uttarakhand, when they resist, dam building, they say that they're talking about Ganga, but it's not that kind of a pan-Indian, Ganga in a pan-Indian Hindu sense, but more of a Ganga that they know through their interactions, through their daily rituals in the local water body. And we also find that it's very difficult to put this kind of an this kind of a essentialized understanding of environmental struggles, because it's not just religion, it's also more local politics of people not wanting outsiders to come and use their resources, or it's not about really this is actually something that even scholars who studied the Chipko movement has said. The Chipko was a movement which became famous because of all these images of women hugging trees. So it's so the women who were hugging trees were, in some accounts, they were projected as people who really care so much that they don't want the trees to be cut. But actually, in some other scholarly accounts, it has been shown that the women are hugging trees not because they don't want the trees to be cut, but it's more about staking their rights on the trees. That it's our trees, we will cut our trees if we want to, but you cannot come from outside and cut our trees. So it's more about claiming possession. And similarly, Emily Woodhouse, another scholar who's talked about Tibet, Himalaya, Tibet in Tibetan part of China, has said that people, they don't take action against their own people who has maybe cut trees, but if other people come from outside, then they don't like it, then they consider it an offense. In fact, in Tawang also, when there were all these anti-environmental protests, anti-dam protests, environmental protests, there was this feature of anti-migrant tendency also there. They're saying that, well, if you construct dams, then there will be people coming from outside, and these people will bring in outside customs, and they are going to disrupt our lives, our livelihoods, our customs, and that kind of insider outsider dynamic is also present. So if so when we essentialize something when we essentialize the environmental struggles as a religious kind of a struggle, then I think we lose all these practical context about how communities really look at their landscape. Is it really something religious, or is it more of a practical thing? And actually, then how do we go beyond that? So if we don't want to package environmentalism as something which is connected to a particular religion, whether it is Hindu or Buddhist, then does it mean that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater? That means we are not against saving the environment. Of course, everybody is very concerned about the environment. Everybody wants that there has to be something done, especially after COVID. It has become more apparent to us that it's not just human beings, but every living being, every plant, so all the soil, everything, the air, everything must be preserved. So it's not as if we are not trying to defend the environmental concerns. So how can we rethink this environmentalism? We don't want to package it as a religious environmentalism, but it is more a stance maybe to preserve livelihood, to preserve ways of life, or just to preserve certain relations that exist, which actually a religious framing may not do justice to. So rather than thinking of environmentalist practices in the Himalaya as a religious environmentalism, how can we think of it as a practical kind of an ethic, and also plural? So once we use in religion, or even maybe indigeneity as a kind of a big word to understand environmental struggles, then it becomes very singular, it becomes very uniform. So how can we make it more plural? Because as we have seen, if we try and contain everything within a religious environmentalist ethic, that means that we will not be respecting the customs of some of these marginalized Himalayan communities.